My distinguished colleague from Virginia, Mr. Good.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm sorry you're not here with me to greet you in person. As someone who worked in a unionized auto factory in college, I saw firsthand the major problems with unions, protecting the disgruntled or unproductive workers, reducing productivity, increasing costs, creating an unhealthy us first them relationship with management, and et cetera. As a matter of fact, I worked there 34 years ago, and they paid me what was then an exorbitant $11 an hour rate as a college kid. And they actually put me in a supervisory role over these lazy union employees who weren't doing their jobs, quite frankly, because of my work ethic. And that might be why the plant closed not long after I left there. Biden promised that he would be the most pro-union president in history. And like his war on reliable energy, he has kept that promise as well. Perhaps this is because the union spent over $27 million to help him during the 2020 campaign. But today represents the classic Democrat response to everything, and yet another example of their anti-freedom, pro-government control approach to every issue. Force you to get a vaccine, force you to wear a mask, force you to close your business or your church, force you to close your school, force you to buy and drive an electric vehicle, force you to embrace their values on transgender, marriage, sexualization of kids, and so forth.
Hey, Mom.
Force you to pay for everyone else's abortions, force you to pay for everyone else's student loans, force your kids into the one government school in your district, force you to pay more in taxes, regulation, and of course inflation. Hey, maybe we should have an inflation celebration. Oh wait, we did that yesterday. Force you to join a union and pay union dues, force you to embrace a union or close your business, which is what the PRO Act would do, force you to embrace a union or close your business. The priorities of unions were on full display these past couple of years, where the teachers' unions colluded with the Biden administration to shut down our schools at the expense of our children. These lockdowns, we all know now, has cost decades of progress for our kids, especially minority students, and we've seen the greatest decline in test scores in 30 years as a result of the teachers' unions closing of our schools. And that's why I introduced the Students Before Unions Act, which would ensure that students are the priority and not unions. Mr. King, do you think that the best interests of students are served by teachers' unions? Do you think that the students are their number one priority, the interests of students for teachers' unions?
Certainly debatable. The closure of schools, even some union proponents I now am reading think that was a mistake. We are years behind, I'm reading recently, in education areas, math and science, because we missed these teaching opportunities, and online can only do so much. That interactivity in person between teacher and student is critical. So I think this country is unfortunately going to suffer for decades, perhaps because of these closures. I want to just interject one point, Mr. Good. The recent colloquy between the Congressman and Ms. Essen, you had an opportunity to vote, and that is so important. I couldn't agree with you more, and I'm glad you voted.
That's right.
So we want to preserve that right. But back to your question, Mr. Good, we need to take a step back and think about practicalities here. Not every ounce of intelligence comes from these halls, unfortunately, and I used to work here and have a great admiration for the Congress. We've got to pay more attention to reality in this country and have connectivity with the worker and how she or he believes, and not force anything upon them against their will. That's not the way we should proceed.
You're exactly right. I think perhaps the most underappreciated in terms of its danger and its damage to the country piece of legislation we have voted on in the House has been the PRO Act, which would essentially, again, tell a business, embrace a union, because you have no ability to resist it whatsoever, force a union upon your workers, force them to pay for a union, irrespective of what their wishes or what might be best for that company, which would be terribly damaging, terribly harmful to the country and to the nation's productivity. 58% of Americans say they're not interested in joining a labor union. Right. There's a reason why labor unionization has decreased across the country. Mr. King, how is it appropriate for the federal government to be involved in efforts to increase union membership anyway? How's that appropriate for the federal government to be involved with that?
Well, it's quite suspect. I certainly appreciate and can understand President Biden's position. He has a right to make that policy decision, But what is wrong is you do not then have executive agencies, particularly the National Labor Relations Board, take one side or the other on the issue of union representation or unfair labor practice charges. We've heard a lot of testimony here today about the budget of the NLRB. Well, what's not been said is that the caseload of the NLRB went down drastically in the stats I have in my testimony. So the workload for the board over the years has decreased. It's debatable how much money, if any additional money, they need. But back to the basic point here, the PRO Act is so one-sided. For example, it provides for fines for employers and employer executives, but a rogue union, and there are some inappropriate union activities, there's no fine whatsoever. There's no provision to curtail that kind of activity. The secondary boycott provision is a drastic policy mistake. Why should you involve a neutral employer and its employees, and they could be union, in a dispute that a union has with another company? That's going to decrease economic productivity, perhaps put that employer out of business. That intervention in the secondary boycott area is a tragic mistake in that legislation. And I could go on. It's so one-sided, it's so tilted. And I would venture a guess that many members of Congress in this body that voted for it have no idea what they voted for.
Our time has expired. The chairman is saying that's a pretty heavy thumb on the scale from the government, but thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.